What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hey everyone, welcome to the first of hopefully many podcasts covering what it means to be a Christ follower, how to navigate this messy, chaotic, beautiful journey called life without having to check your brain out at the door. And as many of you know, I come from a Christian background. And I of course, I was read all the stories of the Christian canon. I watched as my parents, they taught me on the felt board all the different stories and the traditions and the rituals. And so while my views of the story has changed a little bit and how I find meaning, what you'll find is I often go to them now for that meaning because it's what I grew up with. And I still find a lot of that value there. And so I think a good place to start would be first, how do we read this book called the Bible in a responsible way? A way that doesn't have to cause me to demonize the sciences or downplay philosophy and the humanities, but actually learn to embrace them and the story. So let's start with this. What is the Bible? I grew up believing that this book was like holy. Like you could not put anything on top of the Bible. If you did, that was a serious sin. And so what is this book? What is this Bible? How should I view it? I grew up believing theologically that this book was what some call inerrant and infallible. And so I think it's kind of important to understand those meanings. For many fundamentalists, inerrant means that essentially the Bible is without fault or error, which is kind of problematic when you see that the Bible doesn't really behave itself. So, for instance, for some of you at home that have your Bibles, you'll notice in 1 Chronicles 21:1, it reads this, that Satan causes David to take a census. He basically counts all of the people to make sure he knows how many. And at that time period, that was a big no-no for kings to do according to the ancient people. And so again, Satan causes David to take the census. But then when you read a little bit further, you see in 2 Samuel 24:1, it actually reads that God caused David to take a census. So after taking the census, by the way, God is angry with David, and then he punishes him and his people, which again, really convoluted. What do you do with that? The Bible doesn't really behave there. It actually disagrees with itself. In Micah 5:2, there's this other really interesting verse where we're told God doesn't actually desire sacrifices. He desires mercy, which is also repeated in the Gospels through the picture of Christ. And yet all throughout the Old Testament, you'll find these writers, they tell the people that God is desiring sacrifices. He needs the murder of all of these lambs and goats and doves. He needs blood in order to be appeased. So what do you do? How do you deal with this? If God is love, yet he wants the blood of the family goat? I mean, really? So we're also told again, God is love, and yet we also have all these stories of God wiping out entire nations, civilizations, cities. We're even told at one point he causes this catastrophic flood. And we read of God calling Israel to murder their enemies. And then it gets really grotesque because it even calls them to murder the very young, the pregnant, the babies. And then all of a sudden, when you get to the New Testament, you see Jesus speaking of turning the other cheek. It seems really conflicting, doesn't it? And so then there's all these other translations of different ways of translating the Bible. And then you got to wonder which interpretation's better, because they'll oftentimes take one word, one will translate it this, the other will translate it that, or they'll put commas in different places. So which one is more inerrant? And then on top of that, after you look at the word inerrant, there's also this word infallible. And so for most fundamentalists, they would say that this word essentially means the Bible it's basically incapable of making mistakes or being wrong. It's essentially saying that the Bible's always going to lead people to truth. And for many people, they'll even go as far as to say absolute truth. So what about those times, though, when it doesn't and it didn't? What about those times when the reading of the Bible actually brought really terrible events? Think about this for a minute. During America's time of slavery in the Deep South, some of the biggest arguments used for slavery were actually biblical ones. You had these verses like Ephesians 6:5 being used. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. This was used from pulpits in the South in order to keep people from allowing their slaves to go free, like the North was calling for. There's also this verse in Titus 2:9, which was a really famous one during that time period. Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and give satisfaction in every respect. So when taking the Bible literally or out of context, you could make a pretty clear argument that slavery wasn't just permitted, but it's embraced biblically, especially when you read the Old Testament when Israel basically has all these rules of what to do when enslaving people. Then there are these verses in the Bible like spare the rod, spoil the child, that have actually been used to say it's good and right to beat children, like with actual rods. It's terrifying. People often quote this book. Sometimes they'll say things like this: women are inferior to men. Because they'll go back to Genesis and they'll take that very literal. It was a literal rib that Adam gives her. And so obviously Adam is the higher, better one, and she's inferior. And they'll look at some of the things Paul said to an audience, that women should be quiet in the sanctuary. So ladies, speak only when spoken to. I think I probably just lost half my audience. Consider this last one. Nazi Germany, it started, get this, as a Christian movement. 67% of them were Protestants, 33% Catholics, only less than 1% were actually Jewish of the population. So this entire, one might even use the word evil movement, it starts on the back of Christianity. And so how can that be when the Bible always leads everyone to perfect truth? I would argue it's pretty clear the Bible is neither infallible nor inerrant. But before we throw it out, I'd like to also argue that when we remove ourselves from literalism, there's actually a great amount of beauty there. When we understand that this book is written from a people who were oppressed, marched hundreds of miles on feet to a foreign land with other defeated nations, and we start to understand why the Bible for them, Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we understand why this was so valuable. It's like when someone relocates to another country. And you'll understand that oftentimes when they really relocate, those first generations, they'll understand their roots. But wait until a couple generations pass. What tends to happen is sometimes we forget our stories. We forget who we are, what we valued. We'll forget certain recipes. We'll forget our tradition. And so what this group of people begin doing is they begin writing down the ancient traditions. They write down the campfire stories, the legends, which for them wasn't about recalling actual history. It was about reclaiming the meaning of their tribe and what it valued. It reclaimed who they were. And so now, when we take time to read this book, what we begin noticing is this group of people are on a trajectory. They're becoming more and more self-aware. They're becoming more human. And so you'll see this group, they'll struggle with wars. You'll have this group struggle with how to worship a deity. Does this God desire sacrifices like all the others? Maybe we shouldn't sacrifice our kids. What about a sheep? Things like that. They'll stumble and they'll fumble through what it means to be more and more human. And I think when we maybe read it this way, there's a lot more beauty there to be had. And I think when we start reading it this way, we stop having these ridiculous arguments about whether this event happened or not. And we start to kind of shift the conversation toward having real meaningful ones about what this text says about the evolution of man, the growth of a nation, the significance of what it means to be present here and now, what it means to be the presence of love. And so when we come together during these podcasts, we're going to avoid using this book to hold over people in order to control behavior. We'll understand this book is not actually written about you specifically. We'll take time to understand the actual content before arriving at meaning. and we won't have to check our brains out at the door. And so, with all that said, I hope you'll join me next week as we delve into the ancient text of Genesis. It's really a really fascinating one. Really, really, really. And we're going to meet a man named Dirt and a woman named Wisdom. And I think you're really going to get a lot from it. I know I always do every time I read it. Anyways, have a great day. Blessings. Join me next week. Bye.